Hello and welcome to the Court Jester, your favorite window into the wildest stories of the Middle Ages. I am Cleopethenu, medievalist, storyteller, and your host. Today's episode is a little bit different, and I did promise you that this season of the Court Jester would be a little bit different. So, today we have our first guest on the podcast. Please join me in welcoming Anne Lister, a storyteller, medievalist, musician and general expert in everything having to do with Jaufre, which has been a passion project of hers for at least the last 10 years and has resulted in 2 books and a wide range of performances. I met with Anne a few days ago and she was kind enough to share a story with us, one of the stories that she's so used to telling, and then she sat with me for a very long chat that I'm going to share with those of you that follow the podcast on Patreon. The story, however, is for everyone, and I am now going to pass on to Anne and let her take us back to the 13th century. Hello, Anne, and welcome to the Court Jester.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So, which story are you telling us today?
Well, I thought I'd just do the introduction because I think it's one of the things that distinguishes Jaufre from almost everything else I've read. That it's got a kind of introductory sequence that has absolutely nothing to do with the rest of the story. Well, I suppose it does in a way because it introduces the idea of, well, I won't spoil it by telling you who it introduces, but it introduces a character who does come in again later, but it's not integral to Jaufre himself. And in fact, Jaufre doesn't appear until the very end of the sequence. So I'll do the introduction just because it is a bit of an oddity. And also because an awful lot of scholars have spent a lot of time analysing this to the nth degree, and all looking at it from a really serious point of view, the kind of point of view you can only have if you're sitting on your own in a study and you're reading it silently to yourself. But as soon as you tell it to an audience, it changes completely. So it's one of those where it's quite obvious to me that these other scholars have not tried telling the story to anyone.
So, do you want to crack into the story, or do you want to give us some context before you get in there?
That's a good question as well, isn't it?
Because I don't think everyone will know.
No. Okay, so the story is from a much longer story. The whole thing is sometimes just called Jaufre or the Romance of Jaufre. I tend to call it the Tale of Jaufre just because I'm a storyteller. And this is the opening episode. And as far as I can see from my research, I think the story was written in 1225 for a king of Aragon, and it's written in Occitan, which is the language that once was known as Provençal, the language used by the troubadours. And so it's a literary language, but it wasn't actually spoken at the court of Aragon. And so again, there's a lot of little mysteries about the story of Jaufre, and one of which is that people aren't certain about the date, but my best guess is 1225, and I can talk about that if you want to know all about that later. So this is how it opens, and it actually opens with a wonderful little thing that I've put into English. I always have to read this bit because my aged brain fails to remember it, but the whole thing is written in rhyming couplets, but I don't tell it in rhyming couplets because most audiences I work with aren't ready for that. That's really a bit kind of pantomime-y and not really very... Also, it's an awful lot to remember in rhyming couplets. So, if you'd like to hear a story that's remarkable and true, full of intelligence and chivalry and brave daring do, adventures that are strange and bold, battles that are tough, then I'll tell it the way I heard it, if I remember it enough. But if you pay attention, listen close to what I say, for if you chat and whisper, I would waste my time today. You've got to lend your ears and heart to hear a story well. So come up close and gather round, for the story I will tell is a royal tale, a lofty tale, a tale of the finest sort. It's a story of King Arthur and of his royal court. And the story opens at the wonderful palace of Carduel, where Arthur was holding his Whitsun feast. And you'll know a lot of the names of the people who were there. There was Ivan, there was Eric, there was Gawain, there was Tristan, Coedis the Wise, Caradoc of the Short Arm, and of course there was Tristan, and of course there was Sir Kay. And all the men were sitting around talking, telling stories of the adventures they'd had and what they wanted to do in future and love and everything else. And eventually Sir Kay comes through, and he's carrying an apple branch as his sign of office. And he tells everyone it's time for food. And King Arthur turns around and said, "You know that's not right, Sir Kay. You know we never eat until we've had an adventure. And we haven't had an adventure, so we're not eating yet." And so they settled back down to their discussions and their talking and their stories. And they began to get quite hungry. And I think Arthur himself, and eventually he stood up. He said, "Well, we've waited long enough. If no adventure comes to us, then we will go and find our own adventure." And so the knights all took all the equipment they thought they might need, and they got on their horses, and the ladies came with them as well, everyone riding into the forest, which, as you know, surrounded Carduel. And they'd been riding for a while when Arthur suddenly stopped, called everyone to stop and said, "Listen." And far in the distance you could hear a woman crying for help. "Leave this to me," said Arthur. "I will go and sort this out on my own." "Are you quite sure?" said Gawain, the king's nephew. "Yes, I'm quite sure. I will go and see what's going on." So he went off, rode off through the forest, and after he travelled a league or two, he came to the bank of a river where there was a mill. And outside the mill, there was a woman who was in great distress. She was tearing at her hair, she was rending her clothes, she was sobbing. And he said, "My good lady, what's wrong?" And she said, "A beast has come down from that mountain, and he's ravaging all my corn, all my grain." "What sort of beast?" he said. I don't know," said the lady, "but it's a dreadful thing. It's in there," and she pointed to the mill. So Arthur strode into the mill, and there indeed, by the grain hopper, there was a huge beast. It had red shaggy fur. It had a very fierce-looking muzzle. It had thin, spindly legs, and it had huge teeth, as well as great big horns on his head. And it was eating the corn. And so Arthur, first of all, took his sword and feinted a blow at it, but the beast didn't even flinch. And he went round the back and he tried to push it, but he couldn't move it at all. And so then he came round the front and he went as if to punch the beast. It didn't even blink his eyes. And so Arthur did what he thought he could do, and he thought he'd pull the beast out of the way. So he grabbed hold of the horns. And then the beast raised its head with Arthur attached to the horns. And Arthur realised he couldn't let go. And then the beast set off, still chewing on the corn, and set off gently through the woods, through the forest, at a very reasonable pace, just sauntering on through the woods. Well, Arthur couldn't release himself. There was a bunch of the men who were standing watching all this, and they couldn't believe their eyes. And they said, and they got their arrows ready and they got their spears ready. And Arthur said, no, don't do anything to hurt it. I have a feeling it doesn't mean me any harm, but if you were to attack it, then I might be in danger. So the beast ambled its way through the woods and finally came to a steep rock where it climbed to the top, and then it bent its head. And Arthur is now dangling from the horns above a great fall. And the men all gathered below, and the ladies as well. They were all weeping and panicking, worrying about the death of chivalry. If the king should die, what would happen to all of them? What was going to happen? And Kay was so overcome, he fell backwards off his horse in a faint. And then Gawain had a good idea. He said, "We need a soft landing for the king. So take off your clothes, everyone." So the entire court stripped naked to make a huge pile of clothes underneath the cliff. And then the beast moved slightly and they realised it was in the wrong place. But then the beast jumped lightly down and Arthur was deposited safe and sound in the middle of his naked court. And he looked around. He said, "What are you all doing?" And the beast, meanwhile, had transformed himself into a knight wearing the finest clothes. And it was one of Arthur's finest knights who'd been reading up on magic and practicing magic in his spare time. And he said, "Do you remember, Arthur, you made me a wager that I could not transform myself in the sight of the whole court?" And the prize was to be a kiss from the maiden that I choose and a fine gold cup. I think I've won my wager. And Gawain looked at him and said, Sir, you've magicked us clean out of our clothes. And everyone grabbed whatever clothing they could find from the pile, and the whole of them, the whole motley crew, made their way back to Cardwell, where they sat to have their feast. And I think I'll leave it there. That's the point where, first of all, the hero arrives in the story, and then later the villain arrives in the story. But I'll leave that, because that's not the funniest bit.
They did put their clothes back on before going to feast, I'm hoping.
They put that, but as what it says is they all grabbed whatever they could. So they were wearing a
so they potentially
mixture of clothing, yes.
Mixed and matched a bit. I love it. I absolutely love it.
And some people have seen that as being that I've forgotten what the explanation was for the higgledy-piggledy clothes. I think it was about the different genres mixed up in the story. And it was all a metaphor. But to my mind, if you tell that story to the audience, the last thing they're thinking about is symbolism and whether Arthur represents the weakness of the northern French monarchy. I don't think that's what people are thinking when they hear it, somehow.
I do tend to agree. Perhaps some of them might find the symbolism, but it's also a really entertaining story.
Yes, exactly. I think it's wonderful. And I haven't. The other interesting thing with this is that the only other place I've found this horned beast is in a mosaic in Otranto Cathedral, which I went and saw back in November. And it's been documented. I mean, I didn't discover it, but it's an interesting thing because that image depicts the king riding on a horned beast, and he's actually also fighting a cat. But that's another bit of the story. Nothing to do with Jaufre in that case. But he's being watched by what appears to be a naked man. So I think it's the same story.
It makes sense. It does make sense. Yes. Well, perfect. Thank you, Anne, for the story. I'm curious now to hear the rest of it. And if anyone else wants to hear the rest of it, where can they find you?
I have got a podcast in which I read my adaptation, and that's available from most places where they do. I think it's on Spotify, but I think it's on quite a few other podcast platforms as well.
What is the name of the podcast, please?
The Tale of Jaufre. And I also
have
of Jaufre. The adaptation of the story, which is published by Trivent, and it's called The Tale of Jaufre.
That's amazing. And will anyone have the opportunity to see you perform live?
Yes, if they go to the this year. So I've been trying to find more places to tell it because this year would be the 800th anniversary, if I'm right about the date. But I am telling it at the Leeds International Medieval Congress, and I'm doing it as a fairly long session on I think it's the Wednesday, the 9th. And I'm also going to tell bits of it the following day because they're doing a whole event called Make Leeds Medieval. So I'm doing some stuff there. But if anyone has any other places they would like to see me, please get in touch and I will. I did tell it at the Beyond the Border Festival last year and at Festival on the Edge the year before. So there have been a few storytelling events where people have heard it.
And that, dear listeners, was Anne Lister with The Tale of Jaufre and a special episode where King Arthur meets the Beast. We talked for about half an hour more than that, going into all the nitty-gritty of medievalism, performance, storytelling, the story itself, and many other fascinating things. And if you want to hear the rest of the discussion, just join the Court Jester on Patreon. There's a link for that below. There's also links for Anne's own podcast, her books, and everything about how to find her and find out more about Jaufre. And if you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe both to the Court Jester and to the Tale of Jaufre. And spread the word. Tell everyone you know. And be sure to play a prank to everyone you hate. If you check out the links in the show notes, you will also find links to all other Court Jester things, our social media where we can keep the conversation going, and of course to the Patreon page that I just mentioned. And that's all from me for now. Thank you for listening. Until next time.